The concept of nonviolence is a 20th century term coined by Gandhi, Mohandas Gandhi of India. Gandhi also goes on to say that love is power. It's the most creative power of the universe, and it's the greatest force, he says, that is available to humankind, and humankind needs to learn how to use it. A laborer deserves his wages. I think wages of people who do the work is an essential ingredient of justice and of community. I think the human species was created primarily to learn to work. Physical work, intellectual work, artistic work, community work, social work. We have to work as human beings because it feeds our dignity. It feeds our sense of making a contribution. It feeds our sense of taking care of ourselves. And so all work has dignity to it, is what Martin King said.
All labor has dignity.
And so work is not primarily for wages, but we ought to be able to benefit from our work, especially the work that we do outside of the home and in the larger community.
They cannot support the simple right of the ordinary man and woman in this society to have the full dignity of their work and their wages. And we must begin to tell the Democratic Party, stand up and be counted for human rights and for human dignity.
Reverend Lawson's work is grounded in love, and it is grounded in a deep appreciation and respect for the dignity of all human beings.
People of our land need to ask themselves what kind of people we are and what kind of government we want for ourselves. Do we want a daily existence or an existence between elections that's primarily about the enhancement of the powerful and the rich? Do we want growing chaos? Do we want more violence? Do we want to increase poverty and structural poverty? Or do we want to be a people where we can see the bonds of human affections appearing, in which we become more and more connected to each other across every kind of human division?
And so that comes across in his sermons, it comes across in his lectures, and it comes across in the human interaction that he has with all of the workers that he has touched.
Violence is the use of power to harass, intimidate, injure, shackle, kill, destroy. Sexism is a form of violence. Racism is a form of violence. That's structural violence. And slavery was kept in place by violence. And my contention is that while many people may have the power to do such things, I maintain they have no right to do such things.
Domestic violence in our homes is a major factor in the instability of millions of our children and millions of our families. And often that domestic violence is directly linked to what the work is that the mother or father are able to achieve in their homes.
I think that mass incarceration in the United States the last 30 years is an example of institutional violence that is economic and political and social and is rooted in fear. What is nonviolence? Nonviolence is trying to use the power that life gives you in ways that solves problems and heals you and transforms you and changes and transforms others.
Through Reverend Lawson's teaching, you will see the very conscious and deliberate integration of the philosophy of nonviolence through the campaigns, whether it is through worker mobilizations, whether it's through civil disobedience actions, whether it's through direct action campaigns that have provided a framework to build power for workers who previously thought that they had no power.
We cannot do better for working people in this country unless there is a strong labor movement. The labor movement has to believe first in solidarity. We cannot win without solidarity amongst us. Whether you're a firefighter, standing next to a hotel housekeeper, we have to have solidarity across the board, which then leads us to, we've got to love one another.
You do not have to be religious to be nonviolent, but if you link life to your very birth and beyond, you can discover the power of nonviolence. It is a force more powerful.
Grew up in a climate, an environment of love and truth-telling and music and talk and education, and I felt quite comfortable in my skin from a very early age. The most significant moment in that, I think, occurred when I was in the spring of my 4th year in elementary school. When a racial slur was hurled at me, I hit back, and I fought back. For the first time, I recall telling one of my parents about this, my mother. She confronted me very gently and lovingly, but asked me the question, "Jimmy, what good did that do?" Well, that encounter convinced me, and I heard myself making the decision, never again will I on the playground or on the street use my fists. So the Bible has always been a major document for me. I've read it back and forth. In that document, I see the way of love, the way of truth and beauty and the spirit as of utter importance to the human family. A part of all that is, too, who I am. By the time I finished college in '52, December of '52, I knew that we Negroes had to launch a major campaign of nonviolence.
Tonight we have a most important business to try to accomplish. A good friend of mine in Alabama here last
Because
April.
what we were doing at that time was inadequate to change our plight, our scenery. 1955, I met Martin King in the Montgomery bus boycott in the front pages of the Nagpur Times, over BBC, over All India Radio, everywhere. I realized that's what I'd been looking for. And Martin King and I met, shook hands for the first time on February the 6th, 1957, after my return from India. And as we visited, we felt a deep kinship, deep relatedness. And in the process, we talked at length. I said when I finished graduate degrees, I would probably move south to work. And he said, "Don't wait, come now. We need you now." I told him quietly I would come south as quickly as I could. Moved to Nashville and landed with a job, because the Fellowship of Reconciliation offered me the Southern Secretaryship, which meant that I came with a job and a title. And King and some of his cohorts welcomed me with open arms. So you had year after year major struggles that moved in one way. There was no major source directing this, but it moved mostly as organizations and people organized and wanted to advance the cause of freedom and justice and equality.
We've learned from this to us as to how we might act nonviolently. What are the basic problems here?
I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
The Birmingham campaign is one example. In 1963, we went on week after week, day after day. Sometimes there are such crowds in the downtown area that one could hardly move through them. The city, by and large, ceased to function. And the net result was that President Kennedy himself got into the act and began to demand of big business.
The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law.
I have a deep appreciation of Reverend Lawson's leadership in a critical period of time in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement, and in particular his historic contributions to the Nashville sit-in movement, to the emergence of a new generation of civil rights leaders who changed the course of history throughout the South, the Memphis sanitation workers strike. His role in that historic period was powerful.
The Memphis sanitation strike, these 1,300 black men who walked off their jobs without warning to anybody, but made the decision themselves and for their families.
And no matter how you dress it up in terms of whether or not a union can organize, it's still racism. For at the heart of racism is the idea that a man is not a man, that a person is not a person.
For them, I am a man meant I'm going to treat you with dignity and I expect you to treat me with dignity.
You are reminding not only Memphis, but you are reminding the nation that it is a crime for people to live in this rich nation and receive starvation wages.
And our power has always been in ourselves, in our people, and in our unity, in the courage that we have to say no to racism and injustice.
Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all...
Martin King and I talked at length in the year before he died about this, and we were in very much agreement that we had good success, but that we had not dismantled racism. But the politics of assassination greatly diffused us and shocked, I guess, many people and caused many people to drift away, not work on what would have been necessary to maintain the dynamic movement. Well, I don't think that you're meant to forget. You're meant to endure. You're meant to persevere. You're meant to keep breathing, and keep taking a step, and keep leaning into the future. And I really think that perseverance And what that does to strengthen life, give life care and love and truth is more important than anything else. But in my work in labor in Los Angeles, where I started working with Local 11 and Maria Elena Durasso, when she at 23 became president of Local HERE 11 at that time.
It was in the 1980s when Maria Elena Durasso led a campaign to successfully change the culture of the hotel workers here in Los Angeles. She became the first woman, the first Latina to lead a major union of the hotel workers here in Los Angeles. And she worked very closely with Reverend Jim Lawson to infuse the philosophy of nonviolence and to build a rank-and-file-led union of hotel workers, the vast majority of whom were Latino immigrant workers.
It was in the first big battle that we had that I met Dr. Reverend James Lawson. And it was quite extraordinary for me personally.
So I suggested, among other things, that you get the names and addresses of workers from these places that you're from a hotel where you're organizing, and you go out into the community. Go to them. So you get them to talk about their situation. You find a way to get the right questions for them to let them tell their story. And you work with that person until that person then is really talking freely with you and is beginning to share with other workers and with all sorts of other people his own scene.
When you don't know all the details, some really specific plan of all the steps you're going to take forward, it's really important to have the inspiration, but also the vision of what our society could be.
There has to be deep preparation in nonviolent struggle because they have to understand the strategic value of goals which are measurable and attainable as a way of corralling all your resources and not getting confused and not allowing the nature of the struggle to move you off goal, off target.
We had tried strikes, week-long strikes, day-long strikes, delegations to the employers. We had just done so many different actions. It took a lot of courage from the workers. And so we called on Reverend Lawson, and we called on Cesar Chavez to come and speak to us, to help us figure out how do we keep going at this. And that moment, it was a very telling moment. It was a very important moment when the two of them together spoke to us about staying on course, of not giving up, and giving us examples of their own lives and historic moments. And it made a very big difference. And the sacrifice and risk began to involve getting fired. That was a big risk. Maybe even getting deported and getting arrested. And so these were other levels of sacrifice and risk that we had not thought of doing before.
And police have become one of the major sidetracks of activism in the United States. So we did a series of workshops on taking the police out of being the issue. I did role-playing for them. And so Local 11 then, in their strikes and in their pickets and all, became, where formerly they'd been were being roughed up and treated harshly by police, they turned the police around.
Reverend Lawson talked to us about if we had a cause that was bigger than 50 cents more an hour? Was it a cause that was bigger than how many rooms were the housekeepers going to clean? Those were very important issues because reflected the dignity and the compensation that workers deserve. But did we have a bigger idea of what we wanted to do? Did we have a bigger idea of what kind of change we wanted to make?
The Justice for Janitors campaign was launched here in Los Angeles that successfully reorganized the janitorial industry in Los Angeles and brought a new generation of Latino immigrant workers into the U.S. labor movement. If you look at the janitorial workforce decades earlier, it was a predominantly unionized African American workforce. And when the building owners decided as a cost-cutting measure that they would no longer hire the janitors directly, but that they would move to a contract system whereby they would contract out the janitorial work to the lowest bidder, that abrupt change led to a severe displacement of high-paid, unionized African American janitors, and instead brought in a whole new group of non-union, low-wage Latino immigrant workers. And it was through Reverend Lawson's guidance and teaching that he said that this is not the fault of Latino immigrant workers.
And you do not fault the workers that they're fearful of the job, poor paying as it is and tough as it is. They want to keep the job for the benefit of what little food they can keep in their house and their shelter.
The course of action is not to lash out at the new workers who are working in these substandard conditions, but to organize them and to improve their livelihood and to improve their conditions.
I think that also taught us that what we were out to do was not to be angry and to hate anybody. It was for our own dignity. It was for our own cause. It was for our own humanity, and that's how we were going to convince others of why our cause was so important.
This is part of the dynamic of nonviolent struggle. You get your demands straight.
Through these two campaigns, the Justice for Janitors and the Hotel Workers, we saw a major transformation of the culture of the labor movement here in Los Angeles that forged labor community alliances, that focused attention on organizing the new working class, especially large numbers of Latino immigrant workers, and began to use the power of nonviolence through civil disobedience, through street demonstrations, through mass mobilizations, direct action, and disruption to challenge the power forces, to recognize the inherent rights that workers had. So I see those early years in the 1980s and early 1990s as really pivotal in terms of the transformation of the Los Angeles labor movement.
The nonviolent tactics taught us that there are a lot more allies out there than what we start out thinking. We think we're the only ones, and then we expand it, and then we expand it. There are a lot more people who believe in the dignity of work, who believe in humanity and in being fair and being just, then sometimes we start out very narrow-minded. So the attitude of love and forgiveness allows us to think about all the people out there.
America has never had equality economically in this nation. We have from the beginning impoverished Indians, impoverished Appalachian whites, impoverished coal miners, impoverished black people, impoverished women. We have from the beginning followed our European roots with inequality. So to pretend that we once have had equality is nonsense. Well, you do not have civil rights or human rights if you do not have economic justice. You have an elephant in the room that says the economy is primarily for the wealth and power of the few, that the economy is not supposed to be shaped by democratic ideals. It's so very, very important for labor to understand, and working families and working people to understand, that the economic order that slams them, diminishes them, insists that they are but slaves or property or a commodity or a thing. So labor must of necessity assert no.
The history of immigrants and the U.S. labor movement goes back many, many generations. And the reality is that many of the first unions in this country were built by immigrant workers.
If I was starving to death, if my kids were in front of me starving to death, you think I would sit there and just watch that happen? I would move. I would do anything. I would fight like hell for my kids to survive. And that's what immigrants do from all over the world.
I came here at the age of 9, and I started school here in the 4th grade. My mom had left Guatemala because she had to take care of all of her sisters, and it was really difficult for her to maintain a job that paid well and to support her family and myself. I realized that education would be my way out of poverty and my way to support my family.
Moving to Los Angeles was really, really hard. Actually, we moved into in the city, Alhambra, and it was much different then. It was really expensive, and the only way to afford it was to be living with a lot of people.
I met Jim Lawson in 2009, so I was fortunate enough to take his class in the spring in 2009 at UCLA. The class was Nonviolence and Social Movements. Oftentimes we are taught, in immigrant communities and low-income communities that we are destined to live in a world full of violence, that's the only option. And this was just like so fitting during my experience at UCLA as learning about different political movements and social movements and organizing with undocumented students. It was really important for me to have an organizing philosophy that made sense and that was compassionate. And it was just such a gift to have Jim Lawson be on campus and share his experience with nonviolence. And I saw how other political systems and other political philosophies use fear tactics and used violence to get what they wanted. So I wanted something different. And for me, it was nonviolence organizing that made sense. It was the only thing that made sense.
There are 11 million undocumented immigrant workers in this country who are locked in an apartheid-like existence, where they are denied basic rights as workers and basic rights as human beings because of their undocumented status.
I understood that my language was a barrier, but then even as I got older, I always had the resounding no, that I understood that I was also, my parents call it sin papeles, meaning no papers.
How could it be that in the wealthiest country in the world, those workers who plant and pick the fruits and vegetables that we eat each day are paid poverty wages and are poisoned by pesticides in the fields and are forced to live in shantytowns?
In the middle of the 20th century, we were on our way towards recognizing the human rights of every worker. The Chamber of Commerce and other forces have risen up to begin the terrible assault on unions, to destroy them, to abolish them, and to take fundamental human rights away from the worker. So today in the United States, the worker literally has no rights.
The presence of 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country undermines the labor standards for all workers. And so that's why our fight to demand that they be allowed a pathway to citizenship and full rights as workers is crucial to lift the standards of workers across the board.
A part of the resistance in the United States today is a resistance to keeping the United States from becoming more democratic.
After the janitors won their victory, after they reorganized the janitorial industry here in Los Angeles, they made a very conscious and deliberate decision to go after the security officers who were largely young African-American men to bring them into their union. When you go today to meetings of the service workers of the Service Employees International Union, you will see gatherings of Latino immigrant janitors and African-American security officers. And they may not speak the same language, but they are clearly united in their mutual demand for justice and dignity for workers of all colors.
What a real labor movement should be about is whoever's in that workplace should be represented, should have equal rights, and be treated exactly the same way. And nobody should be deprived of any rights. I don't care your sexuality, your country of origin, your immigration status, or your nationality or race. You all should have exactly the same rights. Love and forgiveness expands the reason why we engaged in these tactics or in these actions. That yes, it was about doing better for each of us, for ourselves, but it was about doing better really as a much broader community.
Many of these same issues with regard to integrating immigrants into the workforce, into the unions, back in the 19th century are some of the same challenges that we face today in the 21st century.
So where do we go from here? I think that the most important soil that you and I must cultivate is to lay the seeds for the movements of the 21st century that will reclaim democracy for the United States, that will reclaim justice, reclaim equality. I think that we have to lay the seeds by which we can take government out of the hands of the oligarchy and out of the hands of the military and put it back into the hands of truth and the beloved community.
What has now become, over the last 20 years, it has now become more a part of our culture to have an attitude of love and forgiveness and inclusion versus you're the enemy and we're battling you than I have ever seen.
Too often, labor has not recognized its responsibility to help working people reaffirm their dignity.
And so that love and that solidarity for social justice, it has to grow. It has to become bigger. More unions have to do it. More parts of our labor movement that aren't doing it have to do it. As we're successful, the whole country is going to be better off.
I've not sought fortune or fame or popularity. I've sought far more a kind of integrity with truth and mystery and beauty. And I think that the way in which generally I've been organized most of my life, it's that ambition that has also helped to keep changing me, transforming me, and giving me courage, and waking me up in the middle of the night and sending me forth.
Through Reverend Lawson's work, he has shown the power of uniting the vast majority, that he is speaking for the interests and for the needs and for love and compassion for the vast majority of people within our society. Through his teachings, through his work, through embodying the philosophy of nonviolence, he has shown in theory and in practice the power of nonviolence.
We have to have in the United States a massive nonviolent movement such as the earth has never seen before in the 21st century that will allow us to confront the addicted people of violence and wealth and shake them up and encounter them enough that we begin to reverse these policies of death and begin to create policies of life. At the ordinary local level, there are all sorts of policies of life and love going on.
Nonviolence insists that ends and means are the same thing, that we do not have control of many of the consequences of our behavior. But if our behavior is true, if our behavior is loving, if our behavior in correcting wrong is right, if our behavior uses good means, we sow the seeds for the consequences that will bear the fruits of righteousness and hope and peace.
And make it possible for every boy, every girl, every man, every woman, wherever they live in this nation, to achieve the full status of their humanity. Nothing less than that.